welcome to another episode of The Oath and the Office with Professor Corey Brettschneider. I'm John Fugelsang. So great to be with you, and it's always a pleasure to be with the author of the book, The Oath and the Office, A Guide to the U.S. Constitution for Future Presidents. He is also, of course, the author of The Presidents and the People, and he is my favorite Ivy League political science professor who still returns my calls. Professor Brettschneider, it's so good to see you. Welcome.
Thanks so much, John. I love that compliment. There's a local paper in Rhode Island that used to do best of, and it would be like best pizza place on the corner of Thayer and Hope. And actually, Thayer doesn't intersect with Hope, so but Thayer and William Street, and it would only be one place. So I guess I've got that compliment. And let me just thank you, not only for these great discussions and these great interviews that we've done, but we're both on vacation and so devoted to the Oath in the Office podcast that here we are from what look like prison cells, but are actually hotel rooms. And really, I thank you for your devotion to the listeners and to the topics and to fighting this crisis of democracy and having hope, even as the world seems to be burning. And looking forward to talking about listener questions, which keep coming. We don't have enough time to do all of them, but we'll do some every once in a while. And today will be one of them. And going to talk about, of course, pardons and truth and reconciliation, federalism, and a lot of amazing topics today.
Well, Corey, as always, you don't have to thank me. My parole officer said I had to, so it's no worries. I am so glad to be talking with you, though, during such an historic week for satire. I think it's not really overestimating it to say that broadcast history was made last week with the 27th season premiere of South Park. And they pretty much walked into a burning building with a can of gasoline and a flamethrower. I don't want to say too much about the episode, but I have to tell our listeners, do not just go by what you're seeing, the little clips on social media. You have to commit yourself to a full 22 minutes of watching. Now, I know for an American, watching something for 22 minutes straight can be very difficult at this point, but don't just go by the clips you've seen, and you have to see it, and then you're going to tell other people to see it, because, Professor, in this year of cowards and compromises and corporate silence, South Park has more integrity than Columbia University and CBS and ABC News and Amazon and all of the capitulating weasel train writers. This episode reminded the world what actual satire, not parody calling itself satire, but real satire is supposed to do. Speak truth to power, strip the emperor of his clothes, and mock the emperor for his micro penis. And they did this under contract with the very company that is kneeling to Trump. Corey, there's going to be books written about this.
Yeah.
Paramount cut Trump a check as a bribe to make a merger happen, stabbed 60 Minutes in the back. Colbert called it out on TV. They canceled Colbert. They gave Trey Parker and Matt Stone $1.5 billion on Monday. And on Wednesday, these newly minted billionaires delivered an episode that tore apart the hand that fed them. I've never seen anything so brave, even for South Park. What did you think, Professor? I've waited a long time to talk about South Park with an Ivy League professor, and I knew it might be you.
I mean, I have to say, I'm in Half Moon Bay, and I was visiting friends who are also listeners, John, and huge fans of the podcast and of you, Dave and Mariah. And let me just say, thanks to them, I did what you just urged the listeners to do. I had seen the clips online, including the public service announcement, as they call it, which involves an amazing metaphor of Trump crossing the desert. I won't say too much, but it just on its own is brilliant. My understanding is too, I think they have a website where you can watch it. But they insisted I watch the full episode, and so that they, our families watch the full episode, and wow, I mean, it just captures something that I've been craving. And as much as what we're trying to do on the podcast unpacks the crisis of democracy, with calm and reason and humor, they just do it in the most, perfect but vicious way. They skewer this wannabe authoritarian. And I love the way you put it, kind of going after the emperor and stripping him down, literally, to show him with no clothes. And what better way to show that there is a right to dissent, not only by claiming it and claiming it from the very company that would shut it down. Let me get a little bit into the weeds and the nuance of the context of all this, expanding on
Yes,
what
I'd
you
like to
said.
ask you about that because we got to talk about John Adams in the context of satire and what's happening right now.
It is the modern equivalent of John Adams did shut down free speech. He signed the Sedition Act and went after journalists who were, and this is just so important, were engaged in satire. So one of the most famous examples in the Adams case, which to modern ears isn't going to sound right, but I'll explain it. It's not what you think it is that he was called and a journalist was arrested for saying this, a hermaphroditical figure. Not that he was actually a hermaphrodite, but using that as a way of explaining the fact that he was two-faced, that he was always switching
Right.
back and forth. And this wasn't an attack on transgender people or anything
Oh,
like that.
yes, it was. So the woke intersex mob was in full-fledged
Yeah,
fury
that's
back in the
not
colonial
that is
days.
not what
We
was
know.
going on, although you could imagine that modern controversy. It was an attempt simply to say he was two-faced, that he contradicted, and that resulted in a prosecution. Now, that's not exactly what's going on now. We don't have criminal prosecutions of media figures in that way. That might happen eventually. But you do have pressure being brought against corporations using the arm of the executive branch, what's become an arm of the executive branch. The FCC is supposed to be independent, and it's created in a way to worry about media being taken over by the executive branch. So, for instance, the head of the FCC can't be fired without cause, and
Right.
that is meant to insulate this agency from political influence. Now, what has Trump done? He's just blown through the wall. So the head of the FCC is nothing less than the author of the part of the Project 2025 manifesto. And, there was an extortion going on to try to prevent this merger from occurring with Paramount, creating this new super company, unless they back down. And now, media is being very careful. It's obvious to me that Colbert's contract wasn't renewed because of the threat from the Trump administration that they turned. And there was an attempt to shut down criticism. 60 Minutes, of course, also the story reporting in ways that the Trump administration didn't find favorable. I mean, one of our most important news organizations, they were able to reach in there and in a way that didn't succeed during the tobacco litigation to really eviscerate a lot of the independence of 60 Minutes. And so to have this moment, which really is, of course, an FU to Trump and done in this brilliant and hysterical way, again, without giving too much away, it skewers him. And you can watch him, pulling out his most insecure moments. And what it's doing is blowing those up. You could watch him, you could picture him while you're watching it,
It's
watching it,
beautiful.
feeling its power. That's part of the beauty, skewering this wannabe authoritarian. So what a moment. And we're always talking about hope, hope, hope. And now watch this. It is not only hysterical, it'll give you hope. And of course, South Park is loved by not just people like us who really are been calling out this authoritarian threat, but those who are starting to see the holes in Trump's armor and might have even supported him. And I think that's got to be true of this episode. It's going to appeal across the political spectrum.
Exactly. I mean, we've been talking about Columbia University. We've been talking about all the people in the media who have just caved and caved and caved so hard there are miners trapped inside of them. And these guys take $1.5 billion from South Park. And honestly, Trump's penis appearing 5 times is getting all the headlines. But the monologue that Jesus gives in this episode just speaks to the elephant in the room. And the White House actually responded to this. They claim the show hasn't been relevant in 20 years while releasing a statement about it. The show, folks, is so irrelevant that the White House is going to put out a statement to say how irrelevant the show. Corey, that's like me saying that my ex doesn't matter while I cry in the shower listening to her old Spotify playlist. No, no. This was a declaration of war, not for any kind of ideology, but for this marriage of fascism and media cowardice. And it's a protest act. And we're seeing that cartoons are braver than news anchors. Not all of them. God bless Terry Moran. But they've put the president in a corner. He can't sue them. If he sues them, he proves them right. If he attacks them, he'll only draw more attention to it. And it's a little too late for Trump to kill the Paramount Skydance merger. That went through the very next morning. The FCC greenlit this merger. And I'm curious, I mean, would there be any kind of democratic recourse when mergers seem to really have an obvious political or ideological agenda behind them? I mean, it seems like we're just watching a slow corporate capture of the fourth estate. And maybe it was all in concert. I mean, Paramount greenlit this episode and it didn't hurt the merger. And it seems to be too late for Trump to hurt the merger now.
Well, it's a similar question to the question that we're asking throughout this administration, which is that the corruption is so blatant, it's so out there. How can it happen? And it's very hard. There are mechanisms to prevent it from happening. The creation of the FCC in the 1930s was designed with the fear that exactly this kind of thing could happen, that a president might use the approval or lack of approval of mergers in a way, specifically in communications, of course, which is so important to political life and to democratic life. Its very existence depends on an independent media. So they thought about that. And in the legislation that creates it, they insulated that agency from what they thought was political control and political firing. Now, Trump has really shown that so many of our legal protections, institutional protections, the kind of thing that, political scientists would say, well, it's an independent agency. A president can't just take it over. That's the textbook explanation. And he's just
Right.
through all of that. So, when you put the guy in charge, you get through the supposed independent figure, the guy who wrote the playbook for how to have a political takeover of the independent civil service. And by the way, this is also on the theme. There's legislation creating this independence. So when you break through that independence, it's not just that you're breaking a norm, you're violating how the law is supposed to function. But will litigation against it? I don't think so. I think the merger has gone through. There have been attempts to try to, to stop things like this, but I just don't see the legal mechanism. It really is just a reclaiming of the political body that we need, and that, well, thankfully, that this kind of satire starts to create the coalition to understand. Just to, without giving anything away, one of the things that they're poking fun, that they're ripping into Trump about, is his continual lawsuits and threats and threats. He told us in 2016, when around the time that you and I first met, that he wanted to shut down the libel laws. He wanted to make it easier to sue people into submission. Now, he's not using exactly that here. He's using instead his control over the federal agencies. There are so many wider themes here too, and just to connect them legally in a way that isn't obvious. The Fed chair is also supposed to be independent. So when we've talked in
That's right.
past episodes about his desire to take over the Federal Reserve by firing this Fed chair, who he, by the way, nominated in the first place, that's also an attempt to destroy the independent agencies, and the Fed is one of the most important of agencies insulated from politics, to rip through it. He's continually threatening to do it. He might do it. Then he's in control of the important question of how to balance unemployment and inflation, and that's dangerous. And so again and again, the sort of ripping through the independent creation of our system is part of it. And he has, on the one hand, succeeded in shutting down Paramount and getting them to shut down our most important critics of the president. And yet these heroes, and I wouldn't call them anything less, have really shown us how to stand up. I imagine that they must have all sorts of independence written into their contract, knowing that they were going to do this. And that's part of their own brilliance, that they must have created a legal layer of protection that's enabled them to really say what we all need to say, which is not only that this president has no clothes, but that he, well, what, John, help me. Well,
That we don't need to see this president not wearing any clothes, I think is and yet we did 5 times, and there will be books written for years about this Paramount merger with Skydance and how these executives were watching these guys at South Park do this and having it both ways at the same time, because they really need South Park long term. It's a huge moneymaker for them. And so they can afford to care about South Park's free speech. And the timing that this aired late at night when the merger was set to be approved the next morning, presumably before this president could be told about it. We got a lot to get to. And Professor, I got to say, we've been doing this thing for several minutes now, and no one said the word Epstein. So we need to fix that. A quick break. Back in just a moment. And what could possibly be creepy about the president's hush money defense lawyer meeting the sex trafficking lady in a jail, Hannibal Lecter style? Sounds very wholesome to me. We'll be right back on The Oath in the Office. Christianity coming back to the public schools, and I mean, reminding MAGA that all of these they've really given you is the ability to say the R word and the F word more often. But what did you make of their critique about Jesus is in school today?
I just thought for, our podcast, one of our main themes, and of course your amazing book about the separation of church and hate, that our listeners are pre-ordering and it's going to be out soon, is all about the idea that we don't live in a theocracy, and yet there is this attempt to create a theocracy, and they dove right into that, explaining the idea that we don't have an established religion and mocking it by having Jesus appear in schools, like in full form, and the kind of discussion and humor that evolves around that. So it's on the one hand screwing Trump, but it's also, I think, for some of the audience raising this question, as much as that show was known for going after, so-called woke culture. Now it's really addressing a totally different topic, a different side of the American culture wars, and saying, do we want to have a theocracy? Do you want a principle, not only endorsing a particular religion, but inviting the actual figure of Jesus Christ to enter? That's the sort of parody. It just brilliantly raises the
So
question.
well done.
Not mocking religion, I think, as much as
Not
it's
at all.
theocracy. That's what it's doing.
Yeah, totally and brilliantly. I mean, they've used Jesus and Satan so well for 27 years on that show, but I think it would be a shame if Jesus was upstaged by Donald Trump's penis. People really need to watch the entire episode. I never thought I'd say those words in that order in a sentence before, and now I have. Um, Corey, I'm trying to figure out what's worse. The fact that the deputy attorney general just met in person with the convicted sex trafficker Ghislaine Maxwell, or the fact that it took less than 5 minutes for Newsmax to start calling her a victim. This is a really ugly story. This is like watching Satan audition for a makeover on the Hallmark Channel. Right now in America, Professor, tell me if I'm wrong about this. Our president is publicly saying nice things about, giving limited immunity to, and suggesting a possible pardon for a very well connected child sex trafficker. I'm sure he's got a good reason, Corey, but I don't think they ever taught you this in law school. I don't think it ever came up. Todd Blanche, Trump's former criminal defense lawyer, in the Stormy Daniels hush money case, that guy, his first big move as deputy attorney general is to fly to Florida to have a secret sit down with Jeffrey Epstein's flesh procurer, Lady Pimp. This is like the Godfather sending Tom Hagen to cut a deal with Satan. Corey, they're not pretending anymore. They just fired Maureen Comey, the prosecutor who actually put Epstein and Maxwell in prison. They escorted her out of the building. And it feels like Trump just gave his fixer a DOJ badge and said, you know what to do. We've seen corruption before, Corey, but this is like Watergate as a grindhouse porno. Can you make this make sense? I mean, she's been in jail for a really long time, and it seems like suddenly this week they decided to start offering her a deal.
Wow, John, what a setup. I mean, that is why you are the best in this business, combining the horror of this potential pardon with her very real crimes. Of course, she has been convicted of charges in regard to sex trafficking, working with Epstein. Some of the victims have referred to her as worse than Epstein, which really captures what this is about. And yet, why would the president think about pardoning her? He really sees, of course, the truth coming out about Epstein, including, by the way, the recent revelation that it wasn't Trump, this is from Epstein's brother, that it wasn't Trump that cut off that relationship with Epstein because Epstein was so evil, but the other way around, that Epstein didn't want to be involved with a criminal as bad as Trump. That really shows you what's going on. So if the truth were to come out, and Maxwell knows certainly lots of information about that relationship, possible criminal activity, it's a disaster because his own MAGA base sees Epstein as so evil, partly because they're involved in wild conspiracies about Democrats involved in murder and all sorts of horrific crimes, which of course aren't true. But what is true is that Maxwell and Epstein are uh, horrific criminals, shown to be so in court, and that Trump himself was certainly friends with them and possibly involved beyond that. So the pardon is the way to make sense. To go back to a point that Attorney General Torres, our guest, the brilliant Attorney General from New Mexico, who spoke about how, of course, we were in law school together. One thing he said at some point is we couldn't imagine in law school these examples coming up, and this is another one. The way the framers talked about the pardon power, and I'm going to just broaden out to talk about the danger of the pardon itself, is that the pardon was a benign prerogative. It was in complete control of the president, and that control meant that the president was supposed to use it for things like mercy. Uh,
Exactly.
and yet now, what are they doing? Those who oppose ratification of the Constitution saw this. The anti-federalists, what did they say? They said this isn't a benign prerogative. They said if you have, they just captured it so well. Their brilliance and importance is so apparent at this moment that those opposing the Constitution, the anti-federalists, people like Patrick Henry, who we've spoken about before, they saw that these supposedly good or benign powers could be used for evil in the hands of a criminal president. Now, what's the danger of the pardon power being absolute in the hands of the president is that he or she could use it to pardon co-conspirators. And that's exactly what happened in January 6th, and it's what's possibly going to happen here. And it's why, as we start to think about, as we do in this podcast, not just the moment, but how to recover from it, I've been for a long time with an amazing legal scholar co-writing pieces, including in The Atlantic and in the Washington Post. The scholar's name is Jeffrey Toulis. We've co-authored a number of pieces about why the pardon has to be reined in. It has to be reformed, especially when it comes to the ability to pardon those who the president is potentially involved with in crimes. And we lay out a standard for that. We talk about how to do that through legislation, why it's allowable under the Constitution. And that's one of the things that I'd love us to continue to talk about, why this pardon power isn't benign. It is dangerous, and you're seeing it in this case.
And it's interesting to note that the framers, at least some of them, did foresee a world where the pardon could be used to protect allies, could be used to reward silence. I mean, you've written a lot about authoritarian tendencies in American leadership. Is the very existence of the pardon power as it's currently structured, is it inherently authoritarian? Or has it evolved into a constitutional loophole for potential tyranny?
Yeah, I would say it's not a bad thing to have a power to, in matters of criminal justice, say, look, for instance, to commute a sentence from life to 40 years, or to, in some cases, say, a crime was committed, say, in I'll give you an example, in the disparity between cocaine and crack, there was, of course, a racial element to that. So the idea that we would allow for pardons in cases of people convicted for crack in an unequal way, as opposed to cocaine, in
Yeah.
which race was a factor. That strikes me as completely consistent with the ideals of democracy and equal protection. So I wouldn't want to eliminate it. I think that that's a mistake, but I would want to limit it and limit it from the kind of cases that not those who supported. I think those who frankly supported the ratification of the Constitution didn't foresee this. It was the opponents who thought the pardon was so dangerous that, and the fact that it seemed to be unlimited. There is one exception written into the pardon power, and it says except in cases of impeachment. And what Toulis and I have argued is that the history of what that actually meant was supposed to mean basically nothing, that a pardon couldn't be used to stop an impeachment. That's how lots of legal scholars have interpreted it. But we go back to the founding documents and we say, look, it's kind of unclear. They're expressing worry in that phrase anyway of the danger of abuse of the pardon power. And that should open the way to at least open the way to legislation that would limit it when it comes to at least this example of not pardoning co-conspirators. I'd add family members, that it shouldn't be used for the self-benefit of the president. Not only that a self-pardon is unconstitutional, that's commonly thought, but that the pardon of co-conspirators, which is akin to a self-pardon. It's in the interest only of the president that's a danger. So that's a controversial thing to say in constitutional law even now, but I think this president is just a walking example of why an unlimited pardon power, as the Anti-Federalists knew, is very dangerous.
Can we also just take a brief moment to talk about, Professor, how freaking stupid it would be for this guy to pardon Ghislaine Maxwell at this point? I mean, to see this guy now suddenly cut a deal, say, oh, well, your sentence is going from 20 years down to 5 just for being special. And thanks for giving us this list of unverifiable, completely democratic names. I mean, between taking away Rosie O'Donnell's citizenship, firing Fowl from the Fed chair, the war on paper straws, releasing the MLK files, where the lie that Coke was going to swap out high fructose corn syrup for cane sugar, suing the Wall Street Journal for $20 billion, the grand jury testimony, which is not what anyone wanted in the first place, the Obama Gate thing, and then bringing back the slur racist name for the Washington football team. Are any of these distractions making you forget about the Epstein files, Corey? Have any of these made you forget about this case? Because I don't think people are going to let
Right.
go of this anytime soon. A year ago, every story related back to Biden's age. Now, every story relates back to this dead pedophile.
One thing the framers did think about, I think, were naive in thinking that the pardon was, benign, that it was a good thing, that power wasn't going to be abused. As I said, the anti-federalists like Patrick Henry and others did see its danger. But there was a common agreement that if a president used the pardon for ill, that one remedy, anyway, would be impeachment. Now, that seems far away, but if he actually is so politically stupid as to pardon Maxwell, and given that, and I'm seeing ads being run smartly by the Democratic Party and Republican districts, really advertising the Epstein scandal, you could imagine some MAGA, even Republicans, breaking with the president. Not all, they'll be diehard loyalists. And as they're forced to confront the question of whether or not this is an impeachable offense, and it's not the only one, I'd add those January 6 pardons, of course, the
You're right.
furthering of a criminal coup. And if the Democratic Party strategizes in a smart way, it will use any Maxwell pardon to begin that discussion about impeachment. That seems very far away right now. It is, of course, a place that I'd love to see us get to in the next Congress. And you heard last week Mike Sachs, the candidate for Congress, talking about this possibility with us. And it becomes more of a reality in that next Congress than right now. It also, of course, in the midterms would be a disaster for this president because any sense that this was a person, that was acting consistently with the law, which of course we don't think, and those who probably listen to this podcast don't think. The podcast is about the violation of the oath in the office, after all. But it will start to get more people to see it, people who hadn't seen it before. One of the amazing things about this story is that all this was in public. We knew about the friendship of Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, and yet some segment of the population was so isolated in its media universe that they didn't know it. But now even people who listen to Dan Bongino and Kash Patel, they're starting to get the picture.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like they fed them the Kool-Aid, and now they're angry at them for drinking it, you know? And I have to remind everyone again, these folks aren't angry that they were lied to about the Epstein files. They're angry that they didn't get the lie they were led to expect they would get. This is not the lie they signed up for. Corey, there's still so much we have to get to. We got to talk a bit about what's going on with the tariffs and a federal judge dismissing Trump's challenge of the Illinois sanctuary measures. All kinds of people fighting back, and I think we have some listener mail as well. You want to take a quick break? We'll come back and wrap up the week.
Sounds great, John. Thanks again.
Back in just a moment. This is the Oath in the Office podcast. Welcome back to the Oath in the Office podcast. I'm John Fugelsang, along with Professor Corey Brettschneider. Corey, there's so much going on. It's really easy to overlook this. Federal judge in Illinois just upheld sanctuary city protections and rejected the Trump DOJ's lawsuit, claiming that the state was defying the federal immigration law. It's really interesting how states' rights only come into play when someone's trying to defend something racist, isn't it? I mean, if your state wants to have their own immigration laws, or their own gun laws, or their own weed laws, suddenly, oh no, it's the almighty federal government. But what do we make of this? A federal judge just said that these sanctuary policies in Illinois don't violate the Constitution and that they're protected under the 10th Amendment. It seems like this will come into play with other states. How important is this?
I think, this podcast this week has been about hope. We have this amazing example of the South Park episode, which we've both been careful not to ruin, but also to talk about how amazing it is in generating energy in resisting this president. And the other thing that I would point to is the most important, I think, strategy right now for the moment, aside from thinking about the midterms, is the role of states in resisting this really tyrannical police force that's been built up and really expanded. That's ICE with the this huge bill that's been passed and allocating money to create this militarized police force. That's really, for the first time in American history, a national police force under the control of Trump. We had ICE before, but the way he's using it, that he's weaponizing it to shut down civil liberties, is incredibly unprecedented. So what's the way to fight back? That's what listeners want to know. And the most important strategy, and I outlined it actually in the book, The Oath in the Office, and it's really, this is not just a strategy now, it's happening, is the use of federalism, the 10th Amendment, which says that all powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states, that's the weapon that we need to use in resisting tyranny. Now, that what's ironic and difficult about that is that the call of states' rights was used in the 1960s and in the 19th century to resist civil rights. And so we are using a strategy that has been used against constitutional rights to protect constitutional rights. That's just the reality of where we are in this moment. So let me break that down and make it less abstract. What a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state is using the power of the 10th Amendment, actually relying on cases that Justice Rehnquist really led the way in, no progressive, certainly a conservative. And what it says is that what these policies and there are various ways of doing it through legislation and through other kinds of policies. What they say is that local government will not cooperate with ICE when it comes to the roundup of undocumented people. We won't
Exactly.
participate in this mass police force rounding people up. And now the Trump administration doesn't like that. So they're trying to shut it down. And rather than calling on states' rights, which they love to call on when it's about resisting federal civil rights law, the Trump administration is saying, well, we have a supremacy of federal law, and these state acts of state resistance are illegal. And they are not, just to be clear. And I'll say what the judge says, but first I want to say what the law is. What they do
Please.
is rely on the idea that the 10th Amendment gives local government the power to be independent. Local government doesn't work for the federal government. We have a system of dual sovereignty in this country. We have a federal government and independent state governments. And you can't just say to a state legislature, hey, you work for Trump now, in the way that he wants them to. So they're using this important power of local government to resist. It's why it's so important that we had the Attorney General from New Mexico, that we will continue to have local officials who have the power to resist federal tyranny. Now, why am I saying that I'm hopeful? Because this federal judge just said what I said. They said, no way, you don't have the right to just come in and take over local police, local government, that they can resist you.
I mean, this reinforces the importance of federalism as a tool to resist authoritarianism. But more importantly, it seems like it's all about people working at the local level. I mean, school boards, city councils, police commissions, like this is where the small democratic efforts really still make a difference.
Right. And I just gave a keynote to a amazing conference, actually, of those who work at the local level. And what they're trying to do, which is great, I don't want to mention their name, but I'll just tell you what they do. They form coalitions of people across the political parties to try to to try to do good at the local level. And part of what I was saying to them, and I'll just say this to everyone now, is you can't see that as much as you might be used to bipartisan cooperation, and as important as it is, of course, to reach out to people all the time who don't think what you think, that you can't escape from the fact that there is a federal tyranny on the rise from specifically this president, that there is an attempt to shut down your rights. And far from being something that's irrelevant, local government is the place to resist. If you want to resist this federal police force, we've seen them on television with their masks, rounding people up, rounding children up, abusing people's rights. What's the way to stop it? It is local government. It is refusal at minimum to cooperate and legislation and policies that protect that. And that's what's been affirmed. That's what this judge said so clearly. We local government officials do not work for you, Donald Trump.
It seems like this is a story about how local governments are kind of quietly becoming one of the most effective ways to resist this creepy authoritarianism. But could this really set a precedent for similar lawsuits elsewhere, Corey? Or is this just kind of narrow and it'll be very easy to sidestep it?
Well, it's always a problem with the Supreme Court, and we'll talk about this in the tariffs case, because they say on the one hand, they'll announce the principle, and then when Trump wants to violate it, they often support him. So I don't want to be naive about it. But the idea of dual sovereignty, that there is both a local government that acts in an independent, sovereign way from the federal government, that isn't just a by the way part of American government, it is the core of it. So I have to believe here that the law still matters, and that as much as we've seen the law be evaded in the immunities case, for instance, that they won't hear, and that this will be a place where the courts actually are a solid ground. By the way, it's not the courts acting on their own; it's acting in defense of the powers and rights of local government.
Corey, we've already got Republicans who are nervous because they've been sent home for the recess to avoid voting on protecting the names of child rapists. These same Republicans are terrified because they voted to block the release of the report, the files of the child rapists. It's a hoax, and they're blocking its release. All but one Republican in the House voted against this. But now we're also going to have to deal with our Republicans in Congress being a bit nervous about the tariffs. The reason Donald Trump was threatening to fire Jerome Powell last week was he was bullying him into cutting interest rates to hide the impact the tariffs are having on the economy. Prices have begun to come up, and that was the whole reason. If Trump's out here saying the economy's doing great, then why would you be trying to cut interest rates? He's doing it to try to hide the fact that the impact of the tariffs is hitting. And a lot of Republicans are worried about this, and a lot of business communities are worried about it as well. People are already discussing layoffs are going to probably have to come later on this year. Now, a federal appeals court is going to hear oral arguments this week in this big lawsuit challenging Trump's authority to effectively slap a tariff on any level, on any country, any time, whatever his whim is, as long as he thinks it's somehow necessary to address a national emergency that he doesn't really have to prove to anybody. He just has to say it. They're saying in the White House that this tariff power comes from the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, which is very catchy. It seems to many that this is a case about taxation without representation. Is it fair to frame it that way? What kind of historical parallels are you seeing?
Well, I should say too that this is a place where, and your setup makes this clear, where we are getting coalitions. That's what this has to be about. It can't just be the normal Democrats versus Republicans when it comes to resisting authoritarianism. We have to find allies everywhere who see the danger of tyranny. And this lawsuit's a very nice example of it. You have Neil Katyal is going to argue the case before the full Washington, D.C. federal circuit. A kind of unusual circumstance. Often federal appeals cases are heard by three judges at a time. You're going to have the full D.C. circuit for this argument, showing how serious it is. And the litigation group that's doing this is a combination of Katyal, who is the acting Solicitor General during Obama, and then Republicans, like Republican appointees, like former Judge Michael McConnell, now professor, and the Libertarian litigator and scholar, brilliant guy, actually, Ilya Somim, who really put this case together in many ways. They're all combining out of a sense that this is illegal, that the President of the United States can't just say, hey, I don't like this country or that country, and throw tariffs up where he wants. There's a system of laws, and one law in particular, beautifully named AIPA, as you say, that gives him the power to do this in some circumstances. And what to me is so important about the case is that AIPA, and we've talked about this before, but now that it's being argued, we'll elaborate, was meant as a constraint on the abuses of Richard Nixon. So the idea that the president is using this constraining law to expand his power for tariffs, that is, a subtle but extremely dangerous use of authoritarian power, and they're calling that out. They're also going back to basic constitutional lessons like the separation of powers and saying, look, AIPA is enacted by Congress. The president can't just come and wipe it away.
Right.
They're also talking about inherent powers to create tariffs and legislation, and the lawmaking power is vested in Congress, not in a president. Now, what's the court going to do? This federal circuit, I feel like they're going to win this case, but at the Supreme Court, it might be another matter because you have, and there's a great piece in the New Republic that I know that we've talked about, that this piece really outlines Kavanaugh's dangerous idea of executive power, Justice Kavanaugh.
Hmm.
And this is really a hack, not a jurisprudential genius by any means. And I opposed in a series of op-eds, including one called Kavanaugh's dangerous use of executive power in Politico, the confirmation of Kavanaugh, because I saw him as just somebody who cared about executive power, executive power, executive power. And at the time of Trump, that just obviously is so dangerous. This is somebody who
Exactly.
the Nixon, just as one last thing about the U.S. versus Nixon case, which is supposed to stand for the idea that a president's not above the law, holding Nixon, saying he had to respond to a criminal subpoena for the tapes. That moment in history that stopped a president, that brilliant title that was given that name in order to emphasize the idea that a president is not above the law by the special counsel's office that was litigating it to get the tapes on behalf of the grand jury, something I talk about in depth in the president's and the people. Kavanaugh really minimized that and either thought it should be overturned or should be narrowed. So what we're facing is a great litigation group, another case of hope. And now I just want to be honest that we have this horrific Supreme Court, and Kavanaugh in particular might push this court to do something horrific and just aggrandize even more the president's power.
This Supreme Court either thinks that a Democrat is never going to be in power again, or they believe the Democrats will follow the law so well, and these immunity rulings will exist exclusively for lawless Republicans, and those sucker Democrats will adhere to those quaint 20th century constitutional norms. I mean, you've argued in your work so much, Professor, that the Constitution was designed to prevent this kind of arbitrary rule, even if it's under the guise of emergency powers. I mean, I think our listeners have learned a lot from you about the so-called unitary executive theory. Would you say this is another front in that battle? They want a
Absolutely.
king. They want a king.
I think that people like Kavanaugh, when you add it up, he won't say, I want a king. There have been presidents like Adams before that did talk that way, that the president was a kind of monarch. And Kavanaugh, without saying it, he's using this fancier, more modern way of talking about it, the unitary executive, taking the idea that we have one president and warping it into the idea of complete control. That's what he's doing. And so even when you have, and what you said is so great, when you have these laws on the books that, right, people like us say, hey, this is the law. And many judges will say that too. Kavanaugh doesn't care. He'll find an exception. So one of the worries in the Tariffs case is that even though you have this clear law in the books limiting the president's power, that Kavanaugh is so enamored of power, especially in foreign relations, and so
Mhm.
enamored of the kingly model of the president that he's going to push back. And so there's at least one justice that I'm not counting on in this Tariffs case, and we'll see what the others do.
Boy, I sure hope Brett Kavanaugh can find a way to relax and just kick back and enjoy himself at the end of a long day. Corey, we have some listener mail I want to throw at you, if that's okay.
Please.
Listener Wendy in Oregon writes, "Hey, Prof." And I would never address you that way. I want you to know. Could you explain proffer immunity, what it's used for, and why Ghislaine Maxwell would ask for this before her meeting with Dingleberry Deputy DA Todd Blanche? I'm not sure that's his official designation, but it's a good question. It's incredibly creepy that the grift father sent his own Tom Hayden down there to dangle limited immunity to this lady. They've been in office 6 months. It seems like it just got urgent really quick.
Well, look, she's doing a number of different things and pursuing a number of different strategies. One is she's got this sort of Hail Mary appeal to the Supreme Court to try to overturn her sentence. And at the same time, she's seeking a pardon. Now, one of the dangers of talking to federal officials is that she might incriminate herself further. So, one of the things that her lawyers will try to do is to try to get a kind of temporary immunity, at least in regard to the things that she's going to reveal. And what's so worrying is all of this happens away from the control of judges. This isn't a legal process. She's able to kind of negotiate in secret with the federal government, and what she's offering behind the scenes, we don't know. But I'll just say what my worry is. My worry is that under the cover of um, being able to admit crimes that she's been involved in, she can both implicate the president's enemies and offer at the same time, in the way she presents things, to exonerate him. And the idea that she's going to do this in a way that's truthful, I doubt. She's going to spin this as much as she can to get the pardon, because this is a criminal, after all, somebody who's been described as worse than Epstein himself, one of the worst
Yeah.
criminals that we know about. And the idea that she's going to do this with integrity, or there'll be any integrity to this process, of course, is a joke. So it's a great question about how the power to not prosecute crimes as these negotiations continue. That's one of the tools that's being used unfortunately, by the federal government as these discussions continue. Let's not, just to go back to the main discussion, let's not beat around the bush. The president, as much as I talked about the need to limit the pardon power, it is virtually unlimited right now. Judges are not going to come in without the legislation that I'm talking about and stop this pardon. So, it's an enormous carrot for this criminal ally of Epstein, this co-conspirator, and the negotiations that are going on. She might be able to offer a lot. And the president, just to go to the politics of it, what he's looking for are more crimes that she's potentially implicated in that will reveal his political opponents, but not him, to be criminal. That's the distraction that he's hoping for.
Mm.
So hang in. This is a dangerous moment.
You know my theory, Corey? You know my conspiracy theory?
Please.
We all we've spent all this time waiting for MAGA to break up with Trump. We're like, when are these non-millionaires going to finally break up with this oligarch above them? I think we've looked at it the wrong way. I think the oligarchs are breaking up with him. My theory, he signed this budget, the greatest transfer of wealth from the 99% to the 1% in the country's history. As soon as the ink was dry, he signed these crypto bills. Soon as the ink was dry, the people who own this country, our landlords, let's not forget, Trump's just the greeter at their club. He's not one of them. He owns the golf course they go to. But as soon as they had their tax cut and their pollution regulations locked in and their crypto loopholes locked in, right away, Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal began having all these revelations about Trump and Epstein. I mean, Corey, right away. It's like a Bond villain hitting a delete asset button somewhere at the lair. They just don't need this guy anymore. And I mean, he sued Rupert Murdoch for $22 billion, and Murdoch responded by announcing that Pam Bondi had told him he was in the files 2 months ago. They're cutting him loose, Professor. Let's remember, stop and smell the train wreck. It's going to be a very interesting couple of months.
Here's hoping.
Okay, that's my conspiracy theory. We have another listener mail that I want to run by you, Corey. Let me pull this up. Valerie from New York writes, "What, if anything, can be done to prevent the president from deploying armed ICE and the military to shoot them in the legs, deploy tear gas, arrest, kidnap, deport, etc., peaceful protesters?" And it's a great question. We just witnessed a woman who worked in the DOJ as a forensic accountant just get fired because her husband worked on the ICE Block app, which just tells people when ICE is in the neighborhood. You are allowed, of course, to film law enforcement doing their job in all 50 states, Corey. But what could be done to stop the president from doing these things? What can citizens do?
Well, I wanted to take this question especially, I thought it was especially important given the fact that we have been talking about federalism and the role of states resisting the federal government. But I also want to be honest about how things stand, because as much as there are civil liberties protections that allow, for instance, that deny the ability of the military or ICE or anyone to violate civil liberties, that's ultimately dependent on courts. And the role of resisting ICE and non-cooperation only goes so far. One of the dangers of the moment is that the president might start using the military domestically, and he might use it to quash protests, to shut down civil liberties, including by, as we know, the president talked about shooting people in the legs. What's to
Right.
stop that? Well, one thing is a law called the Posse Comitatus Act, which stops the ability of the president to use the military domestically. But unfortunately, there's another act, the Insurrection Act, that the president's talked about using. And what that would do is it would give him potentially the ability, even over the objection of local governors, in a claim about insurrection, and we know that might be a fake insurrection, to use the military, even and to commandeer even National Guard troops that were previously under the control of, say, California's governor. Now, there's litigation about that. It might work, it might not. My worry is when you come back to Kavanaugh, the reason I was so concerned about him is all he's about is the idea of kingly power of the president. And I think in
Yes,
this
sir.
case, he would say, well, is there an insurrection or not under the act? We should leave that to the discretion of the president of the United States. The more that you think in that authoritarian mode of the authoritarian constitution, the more danger there is that, yes, he might be able to commandeer the military to use them domestically, either by nationalizing the National Guard or by using the armed forces themselves, the army, to invade states. So this is a dangerous time, and I didn't want to. I wanted to take this question because, as much as I want to say there are ways of resisting, I don't want to underplay the danger either.
I mean, the fact that the Marines who are deployed to LA as human props have now left should be encouraging to some people that this didn't work. And God bless the folks in LA for having cooler heads and not letting that situation get worse, because clearly they were hoping for some kind of provocation to come down hard on protesters. They'll likely try it again. And Corey, let me just ask you to wrap up the show, as the scandals get hotter for Trump and we see him become more erratic and throwing ever more distractions at the wall so desperately, Americans should be alarmed about how much emergency power this president or any president can try to evoke. I mean, particularly for economic actions that look like policy that aren't emergencies.
I think that's right. The kind of, if I had to broaden out the frame of what we're talking about in each of these episodes, is there's a long, unfortunate tradition. I talked about John Adams, Nixon, of course, and this president have an authoritarian notion of the presidency. And we have justices like Kavanaugh that have affirmed that really the president is a kind of king. The president can use the military domestically. The president can create tariffs without reason, willy-nilly. The president can commandeer local government. All of those are part of an authoritarian idea of the Constitution. And the thing that you and I are fighting for, and our listeners are fighting for, is the democratic idea. A constitution in which local government has the power to protect civil liberties, where there is a limit on the power of the president to use the military domestically to shut down civil liberties, where policy has to be reasoned, where a carefully crafted law passed in the aftermath of the president's abuses, IEPA, is used to limit just arbitrary tariffs or arbitrary economic policy, that the law exists, not just the power of a president. That's the idea that we're fighting for, and we'll fight for it in the midterms and in the next presidential election. We'll look for ways of fighting in the midst of this authoritarian threat to democracy. And that's where the hope comes from this deep tradition of the democratic idea, which has prevailed again and again and will prevail again as much as it's under threat.
I can't say it any better than that. Professor Corey Brettschneider, thank you for inspiring me yet again. What is the best way for our listeners to follow you, sir, and keep up with your brilliance all week long?
Wow, it's amazing how our we grow every week, and the reviews just keep coming in. This listenership is so enthusiastic. So I thank you for leaving reviews on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, or on the YouTube channel. I'm seeing comments and people engaging there. Continue to do that. And let me just ask, we're trying to make a push to as much as we're growing. We've been in the top 10 in the Apple category in government, 9, and keep increasing. We're trying to get into the top 5. Help us get us there by sharing it. Email your friends, send texts, and let people know about the Oath in the Office podcast. And this is growing into a very large community, and help us grow it even further.
And I just want to apologize to all of our listeners who were offended last week by my comments about Donald Trump's health. And that he looked like a very unhealthy man when I said that his blood type was ranch and that they have to check his cholesterol with a dipstick. I wasn't trying to be mean to the president. I want to just say, I know we have a lot of scholars who listen. I'm just concerned about the man's health because have you seen him? His arteries look like they've been deep fried, and we're just concerned about the president. I mean, he tried to fire his pancreas. You understand? He's not a well man. His ankles look like he's smuggling ham hocks across the border, and his flop sweat smells like Velveeta. So we are not trying to be disrespectful. We are just concerned about that. His body's 40% Crisco. Okay, folks, we are just out of a place of respect, and this can't possibly affect Corey's tenure. This is all on his treadmill. His treadmill sued him, is what I'm trying to say. He just has a Fitbit, and all it does is scream and claim asylum elsewhere. So we're just looking out for the president. I'm John Fugelsang. I want to thank Wendy and Beowulf and everyone who helps me deliver discourse like this at the end of the professor's brilliance. Corey, any final notes for the people out there?
Well, John, I hope you enjoy the vacation. Thanks for joining us in the midst of it. Thanks to the listeners. And, I'll leave you with hope. There is a lot, and I think we'll prevail in the end.
And I don't know how I can enjoy it when our president looks so unhealthy, Corey. The man is, his idea of fiber is looking at old McNugget box. And I'm just worried. That's all. So please, folks, thoughts and prayers. We'll see you next week on The Oath in the Office.